So, switching to I guess, why does the industry do it? I'm just going to show some statistics on rates of return. Now, these are rates of return based on different regions in the Northern Territory. Basically, a lot of these the lines across the bottom, which are top end and Cattlemen region, show some of the lower rates of return, and we can see that we're in negative territory. Now, if we look at that as an average across the whole of the territory, the rate of return still remains very low, and I think people making investment decisions might look at that and think, well, why are we doing it? This is ABARES data, farm cash income, Northern Territory properties. Once again, we see a fairly consistent line through there. The further north you go, the higher the cost of production per sort of animal unit, higher levels of supplementation, animal husbandry and management mean that the cost of production seems to increase the further north you go, and that is into the live export zone. And we also know that the price of beef and the price of a lot of our commodities isn't going through the roof like we would like to keep a track of those increases in costs. So the industry is continually in that squeeze, in that pincer where efficiency has to increase incrementally every year to keep ahead of the game. So it's a pretty rough ride, and I think there's people in this room here who could talk with a lot more authority than I about the profitability of the northern industry, but here to say it's a challenge, and it's one that I think will continue. Now I'm going to switch to, I guess, our relationship in our region. And if we look at the sort of northern zone, we hear a lot of talk about Northern Australia these days. It used to be, eastern states, Western Australia and east and west and all the rest of it. There seems to be a lot of talk about north and south. And I think last year things came into focus, this Northern Australian sort of focus, and the focus on our region, on Southeast Asia was talked about a lot. But look, if that's Northern Australia, and we've got a live export zone, which is something like that. I know Trish's map, we've got some squiggly lines there, but the Pilbara probably doesn't come quite into that little polygon. However, when we look at the place in our region, we are closer to some of these major cities and to what is the largest Muslim country in the world, one of the world's largest democracies, right on our doorstep. We are closer to most of those major centres than we are to our own capital city and to southern states. So you always get a very strong sense in Northern Australia that you are part of this world. Now, that, give or take a couple of hours either side in time zone, about 50% of the world's population live above Northern Australia. Well, live above the whole of Australia, but above Northern Australia. Countries such as China, India, Korea, Japan, Eastern Russia, Taiwan, Philippines, Indonesia. And many of the predictions are that obviously that region is going to continue to grow dramatically and from consumption terms. Our security, and I think our future, is very much part of this region. When you've got a country of that size, it's not only a biosecurity buffer for foot and mouth at the moment, but it's also a really strong buffer for us strategically. And our relationship with that part of the world, to me, would seem critical to our future prosperity and security. Indonesia is a country of many thousand islands, of 200 or 300 different ethnic groups. It came out of 400 years of colonial rule under the Dutch into a dictatorship and now into a democracy. And they're making a reasonable fist of it, but by hell, it must be a hard job. And the success of that will, I think, we are very much intertwined with that. Our future is very much intertwined with that. And this relationship goes well beyond cattle. It goes to wheat and cotton, to a whole heap of other strategic issues. Okay, so that's our place in the world. Well, we do live in a complex world, and certainly Northern Australia is a very complex mix of land tenure, of culture, and of different land use. And if we look at how I believe we don't necessarily understand our own region, particularly when our own people, we move that to Southeast Asia, we have less capacity to understand what people are thinking, what they're doing in our nearest neighbour. I believe we don't generally understand ourselves enough. We have a less chance of understanding those beyond our borders. I use the word anthropologist. It's an interesting word because in the Northern Territory, the word anthropologist has some very, very strong undertows. identified with land rights, it's identified with a whole range of things, but many people ask what an anthropologist is, but it's just an example of social science, and I believe there's not enough study of the people in our region, the people in Australia. Farmers, for example, have always been, we always hear that farmers don't adopt new technology. Why won't they take this new technology on? Why won't they take on this new science that we've just discovered? Agricultural extension has always been about finding something new, taking it out to farmers and making them adopt it. Why don't they adopt it? Well, who knows? There's a dollar in it, why don't they adopt it? The drivers behind why we make decisions and why we innovate and change are never very well understood, and I think, to me, Northern Australian development is very much intertwined with understanding the environment that we're going to be working in, and there's a lot of social science in that. And anthropology is simply, I guess, a study of some of that social science. Now, last year, a group of producers from the Territory went to Indonesia, and the year before. We took an anthropologist with us, a bloke who spoke Bahasa. He understood what was going on below the surface. We see the tip of the iceberg, we see the visible things. We don't understand the political, the cultural, the religious things that are going on under the water. So we've, I guess to me it's just an example of how we have to better engage, not only our own region, but internationally, by understanding the cultures we're going to be working in. And some of these have led to sort of exchanges where we're seeing people move and establish those links between Australia and Indonesia, with the view to making it a long-term thing for our sort of joint future. Now, overlay with some of those complex things, in Northern Australia, emerging markets around the carbon economy and environmental credits. What's real and what's not. Some of it's real, some of it's not. And there's a lot of carpetbaggers and opportunists who are involved in this space, and they have been for the last 15 years. But now we're coming to some traction with legislation in place, and it's really flushing everybody out of the system. So what's real and what's not. This is putting a lot of pressure on Northern Australia, and potentially it will in the future as there's a lot of demand for land use change, and we have to watch it very carefully. Food bowl of Asia. This has always been the talk from some quarters. Now, obviously Asia will never be the food bowl of Asia, but there is somewhere in between is that balance that we have to find. There's also a very strong culture in Northern Australia of basically locking it all up and throwing the key away. Get those cloven-hoofed animals out of Northern Australia. The devil incarnate, get rid of them. And in some cases, almost get rid of the people that manage the land as well. So we've got some very strong conflicting forces at work in Northern Australia. And many of those people who argue for the locking up and throwing away the key will happily sit in Northern Australia and eat the food from our southern production systems. They'll drink the wine from our southern production systems. Yet they'll want to lock Northern Australia up for good. So there's some of the conflicting things. We've also got a large Indigenous land holding across Northern Australia, and balancing the aspirations of those people, both within the pastoral industry and with some of these emerging environmental markets, is going to be a challenge in the future. But clearly, when we see legislation across 3 jurisdictions, the need for harmonisation is critical in that, and our relationship with Asia. So, just coming back to home, representation. I'm just going to talk quickly about Northern Australia. If we look at the number of parliamentarians that represent Northern Australia, you can count them on one and a bit hands. And when they come to Canberra and try and get their point across, it's a pretty difficult task. When it comes to investing in Northern Australia and infrastructure in roads and ports and all those sorts of things and telecommunications, getting it across the line is politically a big call because it doesn't carry a lot of votes. So we're constantly struggling in Northern Australia with this need to be heard, the capacity to be heard. Now that also goes to the industry bodies with which we are all generally a part. Now I don't want to dwell on this too much, but I just want to show a diagram. And this is just the meat industry, and that's the Red Meat Advisory Council there. And these are some of the peak bodies which are there to establish policy. In our case, Cattle Council for the beef industry is a critical policy group. Now, sitting above that are some of the statutory bodies which are there to deliver the services to industry. And we're all very much aware of Meat and Livestock Australia last year and LiveCorp, who provide services with producer levies to these bodies here. But they're not an agri-political group, they're a service provider for industry. Then we've got Animal Health Australia and the residue, National Residue Scheme, and state governments. Now, this just keeps going. Safe Meat, Ausmeat, NFF, state farm organisations. And then we've got all these relationships between all these different groups. And then we've got the money side of it. We've got these the producer levies, which and taxes which go to fund MLA and fund some of these other bodies. And it sort of start looking like that, and then like that. And then, you know, we're from the NTCA, we're a state farmer organisation. And there's another 6 or 7 of those, and then there's commodity groups as well. So it starts getting pretty complicated. I'm not saying this has to change or anything like that. I'm simply saying it's a fairly detailed. But you also see some of those same sort of Mediterranean meals with government policy as well, and government interactions across the states. And I think the industry is not alone in this. However, my point is that industry representation is critical. And at the moment, there is a decline in membership to state farmer organisations, to commodity councils, and that has a knock-on effect to those peak bodies because the money's not flowing through the system. So national representation is not being effective, and that, you know, lack of national representation and state farmer representation, commodity council representation means that they're not delivering the services back to members. And why aren't they? Well, people maybe don't see them as relevant. But what it's doing is it means that national policy is not effective, and that's not good for government, it's not good for industry. And I don't think it's good for our future. So I think there's a lot of thought that needs to go into the way this system of representation is working or not working, and also how our levies are used as well to service the industry. That's as far as I'm going to go with making any comment, but it's certainly something that's in the melting pot as far as industry is concerned. I think government have a strong interest in it as well to make that effective. So I guess the future is we've got to try some new things, and I'll just finish off by putting it in the context of the next 100 years, and I think some of the critical things that as producers and as residents of Northern Australia, we know that the fundamentals in our industry still remain very good. From a market perspective, the fundamentals remain very solid. And to underpin those fundamentals, people need the skills, they need the horsepower to be able to make a profit, to make a quid, and manage their natural resources underneath which they sit, and put something back into the community. There must be long-term returns. These industries have to be sustainable, and we have to invest in our relationships in the region, because our future is very much woven through the fabric of the region. The solutions I think that we have aren't technical solutions. We so often come in with technical solutions. Indonesia was a good example of technical solutions. Come in with a solution, don't understand the cultural, economic, political context or religious context that sits underneath it, don't understand the people. We make that mistake here, we make it elsewhere. So the solutions aren't just technical solutions, they're solutions about people fundamentally, why people will do what they do and why they'll make choices in the future. And we've got to do that. First of all, we have to understand ourselves. And this comes back to the issue about the disconnect between urban and rural Australia. Do we actually understand ourselves before we project ourselves or try to understand the other side of the fence? Because that's what it is at the moment. There seems to be sort of two sides of the fence. So we need to understand ourselves before we can seek to understand those who we want to influence, who we want to use somebody's term. There's a lot of talk about social licence. I don't particularly like the term because it's inferring that there's a regulatory body that issues these licences, but what we saw last year was it was mainly online get-ups and things like that issued licences last year. But anyway, it calls for common sense. The development of Northern Australia calls for some common sense and some balance. So, there you go. That's it.